Hi, my name is Dr. Alerik Arenander. I'm the director of Iowa's Brain Research Institute, and I'd like to share with you in the next few minutes some insights gained over the last 40 years of brain research I've conducted here and abroad, and how the information from neuroscience can impact the growing problems in our school systems and offer solutions to how we can fully develop the creative potential of every one of our students. How to optimize the learning process. Let's go to our first slide if we can. On this first slide, we see the teaching effectiveness. In other words, how good is the learning process? And we know there are three aspects to this. The first is the what, the content or the text, the information itself. The second element is how, the context, the technology, the teacher, how the information is conveyed. And third, the who, the container. This is the student. The what, the who, and the how. The content, the context, and the container. These three elements comprise the learning process. Unfortunately, the context, the technology, and the teachers are usually the suspect in terms of the current concerns about our educational progress. But actually, neuroscience would suggest that it's not the teachers or the technology at all, but it is the container. It is how we treat the student's brain and how the student's brain is able to develop in the educational years. So we're going to study and talk about the neuroscience of learning in a student. The container is filled with beautiful cells. In fact, every student in the classroom has 100 billion neurons that they're always trying to bring together into a coherent, holistic functioning called their thinking and their behavior. This container, in particular, the most important part of this container, the human brain, is the very front in yellow here. It's the CEO or Chief Executive Officer of every student. It's called the prefrontal cortex. It is the learning center. We know that this learning center is related to very fundamental processes of a child's development, how they think and feel and behave. It's involved with awareness, how aware the student is in class. Are they awake at 8, 9, 10 o'clock in the morning? What are the values they bring to the classroom? Are they motivated to participate in the classroom? What are our decision makings? And then finally, how much self-control do they have in the flow of their attention, their behavior? How risky is their behavior, and so forth? And we go back to the slide, we can see a summary then of a lot of research that indicates awareness, values, motivation, decisions, and self-control are all structured in the orderly functioning of the prefrontal cortex, or the CEO of every student. This is what education is attempting to instill in every student, the best of these values. So the CEO of every student is really the center of control. It's the nexus of how we learn. It's the nexus of how every student is processing information in the classroom, and therefore the nexus of the problem, as well as the nexus of the solution. Unfortunately, the CEO can go offline. It can become disoriented, dysfunctional, and to do that doesn't take much. The biggest problem is stress. There's stress pervasive throughout school and in society. Stress takes our CEO offline. It dumbs us down. Poor sleep. Most students are sleep deprived. Poor diet. Lack of exercise. Drugs, and then sports and motor vehicle trauma. All these things are known to impact the prefrontal cortex and take it offline. Therefore, we see that it's important how we treat the prefrontal cortex. Stress reduces the vigilance of students. It restricts their emotions. It takes those emotions and makes them primarily negative. And it systematically weakens how the brain functions, therefore the physiology functions. It allows a student to underperform their potential. We go to the next slide, we can see how most students, and for that matter most adults, how they cope with stress. On the left-hand side we see a brain which is relatively smooth. We're looking at the bottom of the brain. The smooth texture of the brain indicates that the blood flow is the same primarily all over the brain. The brain on the right-hand side is not smooth. It is filled with these Swiss cheese, these gnarly holes, the students would call them. These are functional lesions or functional holes. That means the gray matter is there, the brain matter is actually present, but the blood flow is so lacking that the function is offline. And we can see the difference between the left and the right is the difference of alcohol. Most people, in fact, approximately 3/4 based on CDC data, 3/4 of high school students use alcohol on a regular basis. And we know that using alcohol will actually damage the brain even further. So alcohol is not a good coping solution. And it takes the prefrontal cortex further offline. In fact, that's why people drink. Drinking is a way of taking the prefrontal cortex offline so we have no sense of responsibility or care or concern and feel some sense of relief. So stress then, in summary, damages our awareness. It reduces the awareness of our students. It corrupts their value systems. It reduces their motivation. It disintegrates their ability to decide very clearly and comprehensively. And finally, it basically can eliminate their sense of self-control and lead to very risky thinking and behavior. This is the problem of stress and other activities that reduce prefrontal cortex functioning. So there are three fundamentals of a learning brain. These three fundamentals have to do with how the brain functions. The first fundamental is orderliness. Orderliness is the basis of everything good about the brain. If the brain is more orderly and coherent, then the brain will act the way it was designed to in a very good way. The other thing, the second point, is that orderliness and the growth of orderliness depends upon the ability for the brain to be plastic. The brain is very plastic. It adapts to all of our experiences. And finally, the third aspect of this learning process that we need to go into now is how we can developmentally take advantage of this plasticity to create maximum orderliness. So let's now return to the slate to look at these three factors, the three fundamentals of the learning brain. The first one was we needed to grow in orderliness. This is the key. We need to utilize the inherent plasticity to create that orderliness, and we need to define what developmental strategies will allow us through plasticity to create maximum orderliness of the CEO of every student. Here's an example of how important orderliness or coherence is. Here's a top-down view of a student's head, the nose on the left, the ears on the top and the bottom. The red lines and the dots indicate the amount and the activity of brain waves of this young individual, looking at a piece of information. What they're going to do is take 4 snapshots of the brain over less than 3/4 of a second. So in less than 3/4 of a second, we have 4 pictures of the brain sequentially. And you can see that across from left to right, and the second one there's these black lines, and the third one there's all these green lines all over the head, and the last one on the right-hand side is all these black lines on the left and right and front and back of the brain. This is the general pattern if somebody receives information into their conscious awareness and can report that, yes, I have that piece of information. You can see there's a very complex pattern in less than a second of how we gain information. Now there's a student, let's say, sitting next to this student, and their brain looks like this. Notice the lack of the lines across the whole range of 3/4 of a second. What we can summarize from this simple experiment is that the student who has the pattern at the top, orderly, got the information. They got it. The student without that orderliness, they missed it. They weren't even aware that the information was given to them, regardless of how they felt about it and whether they wanted to respond to it. So the most fundamental or primary thing about information flow is coherence. And then after they get the information, what they're going to do with it, how they're going to respond, what their motivation is, and how they decide to integrate and engage that piece of information in the learning process. So brain coherence is very, very important. It's the core of the learning process. On the next slide, we have a summary of what that means. When there's more brain coherence, the student is going to be more awake. If there's more brain coherence, they'll be more resilient to stress. If there's more coherence, their learning ability will be remarkably increased. If there's more coherence, we know from the literature, a lot of literature, that there's more intelligence displayed by different tests. Different creativity tests increase with coherence. And finally, the stability of an emotional set of an individual depends upon how orderly their brain is functioning. Let's go on to the second thing. The first one was we needed orderliness. I gave you some examples of why orderliness or coherence was so important. Now we need to know that there is this system in the brain, this adaptability or plasticity in the brain, the ability for the brain to adapt, to take every experience and rewire itself to make maximum use of that new experience so it can be more successful in its thinking and behavior. I want to give you an example of something done in Harvard just recently. This is Pascal Leon's research at Harvard, and he studied individuals practicing the piano. So let's say a student's in school or after school taking piano lessons, and they have something called a 5-finger exercise. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3. That 5-finger exercise is used to create coordination and flexibility, a smooth functionality or coordination so that the piano playing is maximally developed. This is an important exercise. It's going to change the brain. That's why they do this exercise, because they want to rewire the brain. Let's go back to the slate and see what happens to that student's brain. If an individual does that over 5 days for a few minutes each day, that physical practice, they're putting their attention on it, the physical practice increases the amount of black you see here from left to right. The amount of black indicates how many cells on the surface of the brain are wired together to function and help coordinate that particular exercise. This is just one out of the exercises and experiences all day long. But this specific exercise of 5-finger piano playing develops and recruits more and more. It's a massive recruitment of cells that otherwise were not involved in that activity. This is how the student learns to be more flexible and coordinated in their behavior. Now, what happens if you take another student and have them just imagine or mentally imagine or think about that same exercise without actually moving? You can see on the bottom row, from left to right, there's almost the same amount of recruitment. There's almost the same amount of development of brain plasticity devoted towards accomplishing the task in the most sensibly, orderly, productive way. So we can see then that plasticity is absolutely key, and wherever we put our attention, the power of that attention molds our brain, and when it molds our brain, we become that. So wherever we put our attention, that's what we become. Now, the third thing was using our plasticity to develop maximum orderliness. What are strategies based on research literature that will allow us to develop maximum coherence? On this next slide, we see an introduction to this, that there is a technique to develop maximum brain orderliness. I'm going to show you a summary of some research. On the left-hand side, this is a picture, a computerized picture from Fred Travis's group. Fred and I have a new paper in, but this is illustrious of some 30 years of research. And you can see on the left-hand side, there are red lines. Those red lines indicate the degree of coordination or connectivity or orderliness or coherence. And there are some red lines, and there's some pink lines, and then there's a lot of areas with no lines. Now, on the right-hand side, we see another brain. This is the kind of brain somebody could have with a lot of orderliness and brain coherence. The question is, which brain does the student want? The one on the left-hand side or the one on the right-hand side? Which brain does the parent want? Which brain does the principal, does the guidance counselor, does the teacher want? Do they want the normal low on the left, or they want the high levels of remarkable orderliness and performance on the right? Well, research over many decades now shows that TM is a very simple, very reliable, very practical, easy tool to allow any student to develop their full creative potential based on this brainwave coherence. So let's take a look and see what that means. Here's an example of what Dr. Travis's colleagues have done with his colleagues at the American University in Washington, D.C. This is a study of brainwave coherence or integration over 3 months. Now, the coherence is measured in activity. So this is a computer task. And you can see that the TM group in blue and the control group in red, or burgundy, are approximately the same. The left-hand axis, the y-axis, is brain integration or coherence. So you can see then that the random assignment to either control or to meditation at the beginning didn't make any difference. They were essentially the same. But 3 months later, when they were measured again, what Dr. Travis found was that there's a remarkable increase in the coherence of the students that practiced TM for a few minutes in the morning and the afternoon. And at the same time, the students that were randomly assigned to not starting yet, but then started later, they had significant reduction in their brainwave coherence. This study shows that TM is a very simple practice that college students can integrate into their schedule and improve the quality of their brain and therefore the quality of their learning experience. And it also illustrates that modern college education can be a damaging experience to the brain, as illustrated by the lack of growth of coherence. Here's another example. These are young adolescents with ADHD in a very prestigious school. And we can see that, again, randomly assigned to either control or TM, the level of brain coherence was measured over 3 months. In other words, their brainwave activity was measured at a computer task at time 0, and then is measured 3 months later. And they ask, what is the difference? What is the difference in the activity between the beginning and the end? So here are some young students, 10, 11, 12, 13 years of age. They have ADHD. They're on medication, most of them. You sit them down. They do a computer task. 3 months later, they do a computer task again. And you say, is there any difference in growth of coherence between 0 and 3 months? If we return to that slide, we can see that indeed there is some growth of coherence. Across the line of the controls, you can see there's some little faint red lines, which means that even though they have ADHD and even though they're on medication, there is some amount of growth of coherence, which is very useful and very hopeful for these students. However, the randomized control students that started TM had a remarkable growth of coherence in just those 3 months. And what were they doing different? The only thing different was just a few minutes of meditation in the morning in class and a few minutes of meditation in the afternoon in the class. Their brain waves became more orderly and their symptoms were greatly reduced. So we can see then that TM is a very powerful tool in whatever learning situation you have. Now, in my last slide I'm going to show you is something which I think is probably one of the most important studies, or set of studies, in modern neuroscience. This is a study on the growth of creative potential, or our human potential. How well developed as a holistic human being are we? And of course, that's what education would like to do. In the next slide, we're going to see that over time, the development of our potential grows, as those 3 arrows show. And then as it enters the pink zone, it meets this blue dotted line. And the age of that blue dotted line is high school. So what happens at high school? There was a tremendous growth in potential, and right at high school, something happens. What happens is that 90% of all educated individuals, regardless of their gender and what profession they take up, 90% of individuals have a premature freezing of their creative potential. The little dotted line going up into the top zone are 10% of the individuals which score the highest on the standardized and very reliable test of potential. So you can see we have a fundamental problem here, is that regardless of the educational system, and regardless of all the things we've tried over so many decades, most individuals, 90% of individuals, are not utilizing their full potential, which means that their brain have not fully developed to support the full possibilities of creative potential. And of course, we know that stress can easily degrade that. An individual can process and behave in one way, and at the end of the week behave in a more degraded way. But we also know, based on scientific research, that transcendental meditation is a very powerful tool to develop the full creative potential. In fact, TM is the only reported technique in published literature that actually increases the creative potential to its fullest extent. It's a very powerful tool. It shows that TM can really help these students and help any individual develop their full creativity. In other words, mobilize the full learning process. So, my last slide, to summarize the research, will illustrate some of the research over about 30, 35 years we've done all over the world, by different institutions in Europe, Africa, United States, Asia, and so forth. What happens if you increase brain coherence? What develops? In the next slide, we see that what develops is, starting at the upper right-hand side, creativity. In other words, if a student has more coherence, they will automatically score higher in creativity tests. If the student has more coherence, they will have more inner orientation or satisfaction on the right-hand side. If they have more coherence, they're more self-developed, they will have less anxiety. More coherence means more learning ability. More coherence means more self-awareness, more awareness of who they are and how they treat others. More coherence means more neuromuscular flexibility, mind-body coordination, more computational efficiency, increase in intelligence, which is hardly ever seen under any other circumstance, decreased neuroticism or craziness, improved emotional stability, ability to have bigger concepts, and finally, improvement in moral reasoning. We can see here that in this summary that the use of transcendental meditation to increase orderliness of the prefrontal cortex, brain functioning, brings about everything good in the life of the student. Remember, we said that orderliness of brain function is at the basis of everything good about the brain, and therefore how we think, feel, and behave. So if we could increase the orderliness of the brain, imagine what the student would do spontaneously, in a very normal, natural way, to develop all these capabilities. So let's go back to that slate and summarize again that as we bring orderliness into the brain through selecting proper experiences, proper orderly experiences will develop all the good qualities of brain functioning and therefore maximize the learning process. So, learning success is equivalent to brain orderliness. Anything we could do to increase orderliness, that will lead to educational success. So let's summarize then, shall we? We all want educational success. That requires we maximize or optimize the learning process. We want happy, creative, motivated, harmonious young individuals. But for that learning process to be maximized, we know now, and modern research has shown over many years, that we need orderliness or coherence of the brain, in particular the CEO or prefrontal cortex. And we also know from many, many decades of research that the transcendental meditation program is probably the simplest, most effective and practical tool than any educational system can offer for the student to develop their full orderliness and therefore maximize their learning ability. So in conclusion then, I can only encourage individuals who are watching this presentation to look into the research and see that there is great hope. There's great hope that every individual sitting in a classroom, through this very simple technique of transcendental meditation, can maximize their learning process and fully engage the system that's been built around them so that the technology and the teacher can have maximum benefit. This is a way to optimize the learning process and therefore our educational effectiveness and success. So thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you well.